Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. We're going to talk about the dark life of a woman who scared tourists for decades, but whose name was erased from official records because it was easier to forget. Let us know where you're watching this from, because this story will change the way you think about mountain kindness in a big way. It's the middle of September, and we're in the middle of Kentucky, in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. 100 years. People knew the area for its thick woods, constant fog, and small remote towns that had their own rules. Back then, it was very dangerous to pass through the mountains. The roads were bad, the plans were wrong, and it could be days before you reached civilization. Travelers needed the kindness of strangers to stay alive, and it was exactly this weakness that some criminals used to their advantage. There was a house in Harlan County that was placed in a good spot at the intersection of two important roads. Gorgeous. For its time, the house was pretty big. It was made of dark wood that seemed to soak up the light. There were tall trees all around, and the wind was always cutting through the tops. When people passed by and saw smoke coming from the chimney, they thought it meant that people had become more civilized. But that smoke hid things that wouldn't come out for decades. The woman who owned it was 64 years old and named Abigail Burke. Her few friends who lived miles away had mixed feelings about her. Some talked about her as kind, always ready to give lost visitors a place to stay. Others talked in whispers about strange things like guests who came in but were never seen leaving, and screams that were hard to hear because of the storm. But in a place where it took weeks for the police to get there, rumors were just rumors, and not much was looked into. 20 years ago, Abigail moved to this land from somewhere in Virginia. She didn't have any family that she could see, didn't go to church in the nearby town, and avoided everyone. Her being alive was a puzzle. She didn't have enough animals or food, but she always seemed like she could find a way to get by. When she did go to the small store in the valley, which was very rarely, she paid in silver coins, of which there were a huge number and variety. Where did this cash come from? There were ideas, but no one knew for sure. When a traveling merchant named Thomas Whitmore went missing without a trace, the real horror started. He had told his friends that he was going to follow the Harlan Trail and stay the night at a hotel along the way. Fine fabrics, tools, and simple jewelry were in his wagon, and they were going to small mountain towns. Thomas never got where he was going. A few weeks later, someone found the wagon in a ravine, empty and with no sign of the trader. That was the end of the story. It was another tragedy caused by the mountain's risks, but one thing stood out. The wagon was only 2 miles from Abigail Burke's home. After being asked, Abigail said she had never seen the guy. She said she was stuck in her house that night because of a heavy rain. There was only a feeling that she was guilty, not proof. The tired and stressed-out sheriff in the area took her story and moved on. But that disappearance was the first of many that would make a pattern that was hard to ignore. In the months that followed, other tourists went missing in similar ways. They were always alone men in the same area, and there were never any witnesses. Families started to ask. There are solutions, but what can be done? The mountains were very big, there was a lot of wildlife, and the falls were very dangerous. Too many people went missing for the authorities to sound the alarm, but among people in the area, a name started to slowly spread. Abigail Burke. One of the survivors who managed to get away before it was too late gave the first solid proof. Jonathan Mercer was his name, and he was a hardware store owner going from Tennessee to the settlements in Kentucky. It was foggy when he got to Abigail's house on a cold October afternoon in 1857. Made it impossible to keep going on the trail. After giving him a quiet smile, the woman offered him dinner and a bed in return for a few coins. Jonathan said yes, glad to have a place to stay before it got dark. It was very quiet inside the house. Any sound seemed to be sucked up by the wooden walls, and the air smelled strange, like mildew and damp earth. Abigail made stew in an iron pot that she set over the fire to cook. She asked Jonathan about his route and how much money he had while they ate, carried, and when he was due at the next village. There were questions that seemed like nice chat, but were really used for something much worse. Abigail took Jonathan to a room upstairs after dinner. The room was very simple. It had a narrow bed and a small window that looked out over the dark forest. She said goodnight and stomped down the stairs. The trip had worn Jonathan out, but something was keeping him awake. It could have been the house being too quiet or the way Abigail had been staring at his bag while having dinner. He chose not to take off his boots and laid down on the blanket to rest his eyes. Just after midnight, Jonathan heard someone coming up the stairs. They were careful and moved slowly, like someone who doesn't want to be heard. His heart was beating fast. He stood still and pretended to sleep while looking out through the cracks in his eyes. The bedroom door slowly opened, and Abigail's shape could be seen in the opening. A candle provided only a dim light. In her hands, there was a shine. It was a long blade like those used to kill animals. Jonas didn't wait to find out what she was up to. He threw himself against the door and rolled out of bed, knocking Abigail down into the hallway as he did so. She screamed, but the thick wood walls blocked out the sound. Jonathan tripped and fell down the stairs in the kitchen. He ran out the back door and ran away, leaving his things and wagon behind. He ran for hours through the dark forest. Until he got to a nearby farm early in the morning, he was only following his gut. Some people thought Jonathan's story was crazy when he finally got to the sheriff. A woman, 64 years old, is using a knife to attack tourists. Even though it didn't seem likely, the sheriff knew that Abigail Burke was being watched. This time, there was a survivor who was ready to talk. He got a group of armed men together and went to the land the next morning ready to fight. The house was very quiet when they got there. Abigail met them on the steps with a calm, almost bored look on her face. She told Jonathan he was lying and drunk and rejected all of his claims. He left in the middle of the night without paying, she said. He was probably ashamed of trying to steal something from the kitchen. Even though her story was cool and believable, the sheriff wasn't there just to hear her out. It was okay for him to search the land. Everything changed when they found something in the basement. Behind A, there's a big bookcase in the kitchen that looks like it is part of the wall. When they finally got it open, the smell coming up the stairs scared a few of the men. That smell was so strong that no one could forget it once they smelled it. With flashlights in hand, they went down into the basement of that house and saw something that would stay with them forever. Things were spread out on the dirt floor. Men's torn clothes, open luggage, rusty tools, and coins all over the place as if. It looked like someone went through everything quickly, but the personal items were the most upsetting. There are old love letters to wives far away, pocket watches that still show the time they stopped, and faded pictures of happy families. Each object stood for a story that never finished, or a life that was cut short. After that, they found the papers. Abigail kept a kind of notebook in which she wrote down names, dates, and amounts in neat, small handwriting. There were no tears or confessions in the story. List after list of men who had been through her house, followed by amounts of money and short accounts of their things. It was cold, methodical, and almost businesslike. The diary went back almost 20 years. The sheriff looked through the pages with shaking hands, trying to figure out how big what he was seeing was. Each entry wasn't just a crime. It was also the end of a life that was planned and executed with great care. The names jumped off the pages like ghosts who want justice. The shop owner, Thomas Whitmore, who had been missing for months, was there, and the exact date and time were written down. He wasn't by himself, though. There were dozens of other names, some of which were known by families who had lost loved ones over the years and others of which were unknown, probably unrelated guys who had never been searched for. From the porch, Abigail watched everything without getting upset, as if it didn't affect her. When they finally showed her the proof, she didn't say she wasn't guilty. She just said she did what had to be done. Stay alive in those dangerous mountains. She talked as if she agreed with shooting wild animals, not the systematic killing of people. It was scarier that she was so cold than if she had been upset. This woman had turned kindness into a trap for killing people, and she didn't see them as people but as things she could use. But Abigail wouldn't say anything about what happened to the bodies when the guys asked. The land around the house was very big, with thick woods, deep ravines, and springs that were hard to find. Lies for many years. Some people thought she had used the pig she raised to look for evidence, which is a bad habit that would make it hard to find her. Others thought there might be graves all over the woods that were only marked in her memory. This made the story even more scary because the whole truth would never be found. The arrest of Abigail Burke shocked people all over the Appalachian area. Louisville and Cincinnati newspapers ran shocking stories about the woman who had been an attacker for 20 years without being caught. At the time, the news called her many things, such as the Black Widow of the mountains and the Hostess of Death. But in those remote areas, her real name would quickly become linked to fear. Families who had lost loved ones years before finally knew what happened, even if it hurt more than it helped. The trial was supposed to happen in Harlan County, but something came up that made that impossible. At that time, the law was hard to understand when it came to crimes without. Bodies were found. Even though there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, an incriminating diary, and testimony from Jonathan Mercer, the lawyers claimed that the case could still go to court without definitive physical proof. Some lawyers in the capital think the case could be taken to higher courts, which means there is a chance that Abigail could be freed on legal grounds in the end. The people in the area didn't want to believe this was possible. It was men who found that basement and stored the things of many people. They couldn't sleep at night because they had victims in their hands. Not only did the wives of the missing want legal justice, they also wanted spiritual justice. It became more and more clear that the formal system would not be able to handle something this huge. There were also other ways to solve problems in the Appalachian Mountains, where the government often came too late. There was something that happened the night before the trial that was never publicly recorded, but was known by everyone in the area. A group of guys in masks broke into the jail where Abigail was being held. They restrained the night guard without using too much force, just enough to keep him from moving, and took the prisoner out of her cell. She didn't scream or beg, though. Years later, it was said that all she said was that she had been expecting this since the moment she was caught. The guys took her to a place in the mountains that only people who live there know about. It was an old area that had been used for generations to settle disagreements that couldn't be solved by the law. Under the old trees and clear sky of the Appalachians, there was what the official story called the escape and disappearance, but everyone knew was a community meeting. The body of Abigail Burke was never found, the same way she did with her victims. There was a dark harmony to this, a poetic justice that could never be found in written law. The official story in the press was that she had run away at night and gone to unknown places, maybe to the west or Tennessee, but no one really thought it was true. The sheriff did a quick check, talked to a few people, and searched the area. The case was then closed as an unsolved runaway. There wasn't any real effort to find her. It was like everyone agreed in their heads that some stories were better off unknown. After Abigail Burke went missing, the house was left empty. People didn't want to buy the land. No one dared to walk by the dark wooden house that looked like it had been through a lot of bad things. For months, the building stayed the same, an unintentional reminder of the terrible things that had happened there. The broken windows let in wind, and people started hearing strange sounds coming from the land at night when there was no moon. Some people in the neighborhood finally decided that the house could no longer stand. The next fall, on a foggy morning, a group of guys with tools and torches showed up. They carefully took apart the building plank by plank, setting each piece on fire. Wood until there was only ash left. The basement was shut off like a tomb and full of dirt and rocks. After a few days, all that was left was an empty lot with foundation marks that plants would soon cover up. But getting rid of the house didn't get rid of the thought of what had happened. In the Appalachian Mountains, stories about Abigail Burke turned into tales that people told each other around campfires. Children were told by their parents about the risks of staying with strangers. Tourists became being more careful and suspicious and bringing weapons even on short trips. There was no longer any innocence in the area, and it would take generations for people to trust their new neighbors again. There don't seem to be many official records about the case. The detailed record of so many names and events in Abigail's diary was taken away from the county archives sometime in the following decades. It was destroyed on purpose, some say, so families wouldn't have to go through the pain of seeing their loved ones die. Names were written down in a cold, businesslike way. Others think that a macabre collector stole it because they were interested in how unique and dark the object was. Today, only bits and pieces of it can be found in modern newspapers, personal letters from residents, and a few court records that have been kept. Researchers who are trying to put together the full timeline of the crimes have run into frustrating gaps. How many people were really hurt? The notebook had a list of names, but had all of them died? Were some of them just lists of regular guests who paid and left? Because of this, it's hard to say for sure, but conservative estimates say at least 30 men over the course of 20 years. There were also questions about how Abigail kept the plan going for so long without anyone noticing sooner. Part of the answer lies in how remote the area is. Before the Civil War, the Appalachians were their own world and whole towns could live there. Almost no touch with the government at the center. The sheriff, who was closest, was days away, and his area was so big that it was impossible to patrol it well. But there was one more important thing that let Abigail work without being caught for so long. Her victims were guys who were traveling alone and didn't have strong ties to the places they were going. Many of them were traveling merchants, migrant workers, or explorers looking for work in the West. While these men were gone, there wasn't always someone waiting for them, someone who would call for help if they didn't get there on time. They disappeared into the great American wilderness, and no one saw them again. Abigail knew exactly how vulnerable it is for people to travel alone. She carefully picked her victims, ignoring anyone who talked about having close family or important obligations. The men she asked at dinner, which seemed like normal questions, were used to see if they would be sought after or not. The choice was cold and well thought out by someone who really understood how flawed the social system was at the time. There are also records that show Abigail had friendly relationships with some well-known merchants in the area. These people could vouch for her reputation if anyone had doubts. She sometimes went to nearby towns to buy supplies. She was always polite and quiet, putting on a show of respectability that kept people from noticing her. The people saw her as an old woman living alone in the mountains, which was a form of social camouflage, protected them from being looked into further. A few friends who lived miles away from Abigail's house had mixed feelings about her, even after they found out the truth. Some said they had always had a bad feeling about the house, which made them stay away from it. Others said they didn't think anything was wrong because the woman seemed like any other lone survivor trying to make it in Appalachia. This difference in how people see things shows us something troubling about people and being able to spot evil even when it's acting normally. A witness called Martha Hensley, who lived with her husband on a farm about 5 miles from Abigail's home, was one of the most interesting ones. In 2 different incidents over the years, Martha told the local newspaper that she had seen Abigail setting fire to a lot of clothes and fabrics on the property. At the time, Martha thought they were just getting rid of old things, which was common in that age when nothing was wasted. Reason. Later, she realized that she might have seen proof being thrown away. Yet another story came from Samuel Grove, a blacksmith in the nearby village. He remembered that Abigail would sometimes bring tools to be sharpened, like farm and hunting knives. Samuel didn't give it much thought. In the woods, everyone needed well-kept tools to stay alive, but he did remember a strange detail that became important later. Abigail always insisted on leaving work until it was done. She never put her tools down to be found later, as if she didn't want anyone to look at them too closely. Some people who lived far away said they had heard faint screams at night, which could have been wild animals or something much worse during the years. But in the mountains, where panthers and other dangerous animals walked freely, it was easy to think that any noises that were bothersome were coming from animals. No one was looking into screams in the middle of the night, even when they came from a private land that belonged to an old woman who everyone thought was safe in her home. The case of Abigail Burke brings up important questions about how attackers were able to hide their activities from plain sight. She wasn't a mysterious person who came out of the dark. She was always there in the neighborhood, even if she was only slightly noticeable. She took care of her property, paid her bills, and didn't seem to be up to any trouble. And maybe that's exactly what made her story so scary. The scary thing wasn't tucked away in a cave, or an impossible forest. People thought that a 64-year-old woman couldn't really be a threat because the house had wooden walls to keep them safe. Criminal behavior experts who looked at the case many years later were amazed by how patient Abigail was. She didn't act out of emotion or whim. Each act was carefully planned, carried out, and then cleaned up afterward. From her notebook, it looked like she had a cool and organized mind. She saw it as dark business instead of acts of violence. It is very rare and very disturbing to be able to separate emotion from behavior in this way. The question of how she began is also there. No one is born knowing how to do crimes so well. There must have been a first try, which was probably shaky and made up on the spot. Over time, the method got better, but this development isn't shown in the records. About 20 years before she was caught, Abigail went to that house. She was already a middle-aged woman with a complicated past. Where did she come from? What was? Where she came from in Virginia? There has never been a good answer to these questions. Some scholars have looked through Virginia property and census records to try to figure out where Abigail Burke came from, but all they have found are other women with similar names and no clear link. She seemed to have come out of nowhere, already fully formed as a killer. The fact that there is no written record of their past adds to the mystery of the case. Who was Abigail Burke before she became the great leader of the Appalachians? Did any other people get hurt? Somewhere else, hidden in faraway places with names we will never know? The land where everything happened is slowly being taken over by trees. After more than 150 years, almost nothing is left except for a few foundation stones that are covered in moss and thick plants. Fans of scary stories sometimes try to find the exact site using old maps and vague descriptions as a help. Some people say that when they walk on that land, they feel a heavy air and a sense that it holds secrets that should not be bothered at all. Abigail Burke's absence could have been the end of the investigation into her, but the case had effects that were felt for a long time. Families who had lost loved ones years before started to speak out. They brought old letters, last messages, and travel routes that always went through the Harlem area with them. What was meant to be the end of a story turned into the painful reopening of wounds that many people thought were already better. Each new statement made things more complicated. the case, showing patterns that weren't seen when the parts were looked at separately. An American woman named Abigail Pritchard from Nashville, Tennessee, told one of the most moving stories. Henry Pritchard, her husband, had left in 1848 to sell watches made in the Eastern workshops. He was very organized and sent Eleanor letters every week with information about his sales and where they were held. The letters kept coming for 3 weeks. Henry said in the last one that he was going to the Kentucky mountains and was expecting to come back in 2 weeks. She was never heard from again. Eleanor thought her husband had died in an accident on the dangerous Appalachian trails for 9 years, until she read about Abigail Burke in the news. Henry's name wasn't one of the few that had been made public, but Eleanor knew the path that the stories had described. She took her husband's last letter with her to Harland in the hopes of getting some kind of proof or closure. The sheriff looked for Abigail's lost book, but it was too late. It had been lost in the records. Henry might have been one of the victims, but there was no way to be sure. He might have died somewhere else in those dangerous mountains. Ellen went back to Tennessee without any clear answers, but with the sad knowledge that she might have finally figured out what happened to the man she loved. Stories like this came from towns and cities all over the area. A shoemaker from Louisville who went missing in 1852. A traveling preacher from North Carolina who never got to the towns he was meant to visit. 1845. A soldier of the Mexican War who went west in 1849 and was never seen again. In each case, bad luck, illness, or natural tragedies could be to blame. Putting them all next to each other and showing how they all ended up in the same area over the course of 20 years made the pattern clear and scary. Even more upsetting was seeing how many of these families had just moved on with their lives after losing a loved one, thinking that life on the American border was harsh and hard to predict. It was true. Every year, thousands of people die while crossing territory because of violence or accidents. The difference was that many of these deaths were not natural or caused by luck. Instead, they were the result of a predator who used the area's isolation to improve their chances of killing. At the time, some reporters tried to figure out how many people traveled through that part of Appalachia every year. The exact number wasn't known, but estimates put the number of lone. Many people travel through those areas every year. Abigail could keep doing what she was doing forever as long as she picked a few victims every year and kept the dates of the killings random so that there were no clear patterns. It was a strategy of hiding by being moderate, one that showed cold intelligence and planning for the long term. There was also the money issue. Abigail used a variety of silver coins to pay for her purchases. Some were made in different states, and others were made in different years. A smart shop owner in the village. Over the years, he had kept some of these coins, more out of interest in coins than out of suspicion. He knew that these coins told a story without words when the case was opened. Each one probably came from a different man's pocket and held both money and the memory of a life that was cut short. The psychological side of the case both interested and scared people. Why would someone keep such a secret for 20 years without showing any outward signs of being guilty or mentally ill? Abigail often went to the local grocery store, briefly talked with other residents, and sometimes took part in village events. There were no reports of crazy behavior, emotional breakdowns, or moments when they confessed without thinking. She was an unimportant but stable person in the community, and she secretly wrote down crimes that most people would never think of. Modern psychologists who have looked into the case have come up with a number of possible explanations. Some people think that Abigail may have had some kind of. She had emotional dissociation, which let her separate her violent behavior from her normal life. Others think that unresolved traumas in her past may have shaped her ideas about right and wrong and the worth of every human life. But these are all just theories based on bits and pieces of information that try to make sense of the incomprehensible through scientific lenses that might not work well for such unique minds. One particularly disturbing thing that came out of later investigations was the finding out that Abigail wasn't by herself. Witnesses said they sometimes saw someone else on the property, a figure that came and went without a clear explanation. Some said she was a young woman, while others said she was an older woman. The details given were too vague and inconsistent to make a clear picture, but they did raise the scary possibility that there was a partner who was never caught or identified. This idea gained more support when researchers found among. The things that were found in the basement were letters that were not addressed to Abigail Burke. She wrote from a town on the coast of South Carolina, and her name was Sarah Clemens. It was boring. It was about family problems and rumors going around town. But the fact that these letters existed suggested that Abigail had ties that she had been trying to hide. What did Sarah Clemens do? Could it have been a fake name that Abigail used? Or was someone else involved? It was just as hard to find Sarah Clemens as it was to find Abigail. Past. Investigators went to the coastal town in South Carolina mentioned in the letters. It is a small community of fishermen and traders. They wanted to find records or people who knew this mysterious woman. The mystery was not solved by what they found. Instead, it got worse. Many years ago, there was a woman named Sarah Clemens who lived in that area. She died in 1832, which is almost 30 years before Abigail's crimes were discovered. Sarah died at age 42, leaving her husband and no children, grandchildren. But this part of the story became unclear. Sarah's husband, William Clemens, sold everything they owned together just a few months after she died and was no longer found in local records. Some older residents had vague memories of the couple. They said that Sarah was quiet and William was a businessman who traveled a lot. There was no clear link between these accounts and Abigail Burke. A chance discovery, on the other hand, completely changed the case's view. Anne, an amateur historian looking through Virginia property records, found papers for a land deal that happened in 1837. It said that Abigail Clemens bought the house, not Burke. The house was in a rural area close to mountains. It was sold again 5 years later, after the owner reportedly moved to Kentucky. The dates fit perfectly with what was known about when Abigail got to the Harland area. This new information brought up a scary possibility. Sarah and Abigail. Were they the same person or family? Cousins? Or maybe a mother and daughter who gave false ages? In the 1800s, records were notoriously wrong, especially in rural areas where births and deaths were not always reported officially. Women often took on the identities of deceased family members to get money or stay out of trouble. The truth about Sarah Clemens and Abigail Burke's relationship stayed hidden in the gaps in historical records. Everyone knew for sure that Abigail had used more than one name. She changed her identity a lot throughout her life, which showed that she was either running away from something or hiding a troubled past. It's possible that crimes happened in other places and victims were buried in faraway places under different skies. It's possible that the Harland estate wasn't the start of her criminal life, but rather the most well-known part of a much longer and darker tale. As these details came to light in the months after Abigail went missing, the Harland community found it hard to deal with them. The trauma for everyone. People had lost a lot of faith in the basic social structures that kept their society running after the case. In the mountains, where people often relied on the kindness of strangers to stay alive, hospitality was a core value. Abigail had messed up this holy tradition by turning the open door into a way to die. When people found out that evil had been hiding behind a nice smile for a long time, how could they trust each other again? Some residents became very paranoid and suspicious of everyone, neighbors, and refusing to talk to anyone they don't know. Families who used to leave their doors unlocked started making their houses more secure, like small forts. In the towns in this area, social life changed a lot. People became more closed off and suspicious. It seemed like Abigail had hurt everyone so deeply that it would take generations to heal. Ministers at a nearby church tried to bring spiritual peace by preaching about faith and forgiveness. But a lot of people in the community had trouble balancing their religious. Believing what you think happened with what really happened. What kind of good God could let this kind of evil go on for 20 years? For what reason had none of the travelers been saved by God? Many people had faith breakdowns because of these theological questions, and some even left organized religion altogether. Some people also looked for supernatural signs or answers that didn't make sense. People began to talk about seeing ghosts at the site where Abigail's house had burned down. Some said they heard moans in the wind as they went by at night. Some people said they saw strange lights floating through the trees where the house used to be. People probably made up these stories out of fear and traumatized imaginations, but they showed how deeply and permanently the case had become part of local legend. A traveling preacher who came to Harlan a few years after the events used Abigail Burke's story to show how evil works in his talks. He said that real horror wasn't in spirits or other supernatural beings, but in the way that routine can make terrible things seem normal. Abigail got better at killing people with each crime she did until it became as normal for her as doing any other job around the house. The preacher saw this as the real face of evil in the world, making fear seem silly. Newspapers kept writing about the case for years, and every new piece of information made for shocking headlines. But as time went on, the story changed and became less clear. Some news outlets lied about how many people were hurt to sell more copies. Others added made-up details, like rumors of cannibalism or satanic practices that were not based on real events. Over time, layers of sensationalism and common mythology covered up the truth about Abigail Burke. This change from true history to a skewed legend made things hard for scholars in the future. They tried to piece together what happened by reading written accounts, but found stories that were at odds with each other and couldn't be put together. What was true? Which ones were made up? How many people were really hurt? What happened to Abigail after she was caught? As witnesses died and important records were lost or destroyed, it got harder and harder to answer these questions. It took decades for serious researchers to start looking into Abigail Burke's case with a critical eye and strict methods. Around 1920, Harold Brearlin, a history professor at the University of Kentucky, spent years trying to figure out what was true and what was false. Brearlin went all over the Appalachians, talking to the children and grandchildren of people involved in the case and going through old county and library records to find any information he could. What he found was both interesting and annoying at the same time. Brearlin confirmed through cross-recording that at least 17 men had gone missing in the Harlan area while Abigail was in business. All of the men were traveling alone and had routes close to his property. This number was too low because it only when there is family history or official records. Given how many men of that time moved without leaving a formal trail, the real number could be twice or 3 times that. A lot of them were newcomers, seasonal workers, or travelers who didn't have any family, people whose disappearances would not be looked into by the police. The thing Brearlin couldn't find was a solid record of what happened to Abigail Burke in the end. The official story about how they got away seemed less and less likely as he looked into it. A Enslavement a year-old woman who had no known whereabouts and was known to everyone in the area just disappeared without a trace. It was possible, but statistically not likely. Brearlin talked to the children and grandchildren of the men who were involved in the first arrest. No one directly admitted guilt, but the stories they told hinted that the community had acted without following the law. In the past, this kind of private justice system made sense, even though it would be bad in today's legal world. Time. The official justice system wasn't ready to deal with crimes of this size in such remote areas. Trials took months and courts were far away. There was a real chance that a criminal who had admitted guilt could get away with not being punished properly because of a legal technicality, for groups of people who had been following their own customs for many years. Not only did it make sense, but it also seemed morally right to solve the problem locally. Brearlin also found something that the official records had left out totally. Abigail had done nothing, all by herself during those years. There were hints that at least one other person was involved in some of the crimes. It was most likely someone who helped her with the harder physical jobs. Witnesses had sometimes said they saw silhouettes of people moving around the property at night that didn't look like Abigail. This person was never named or caught, and they probably left the area when the crimes were discovered. How to find this possible partner? It's still one of the biggest puzzles in the case. A nephew or cousin of Abigail's might have been the person who did it, drawn in by the promise of easy money. Others thought it might have been someone who was being held against their will and was being made to take part through threats or tricks. There were even scarier ideas that this person might have been a victim in the past who had been held captive and turned into an unwitting helper, but there was no solid evidence to back this. A scary option. Brearlin's work came out in 1924 as an academic book that wasn't widely read. The story of Abigail Burke continued to be mostly told orally in the Appalachian Mountains, and not many people outside of academia read the book. It wasn't until many people became interested in past crimes again decades later that the case got a lot of attention again. The story was found again by writers, documentarians, and historians, each with their own take on it. Understanding and stress. The reason why Abigail did what she did was one of the most debated topics among these modern experts. Pure greed was the most clear reason. The victims had cash, valuables, and things that could be sold on them. Systematically robbing tourists was a big way for a woman living alone in a poor area to make money. But some thinkers said there was something more complicated going on. The careful method, the detailed diary, and the lack of regret were all very clear, suggested deeper psychological reasons than just a need for money. A part of Abigail may have felt powerful and in charge when she did these things. In a society where women, especially older women living alone, didn't have many chances to really be independent, her actions could have been a twisted way for her to show her power and control. She decided who lived and died, who moved on, and who would never come back. Having the power to kill or live could have become addicting in a way that stolen money never could. Different ideas. She may have had unresolved pain in the past. Maybe Abigail had been abused by men at some point in her life, which made her want to get back at them so badly that she hurt innocent male tourists. Even though this explanation made sense from a psychological point of view, it was still just a guess because there was no solid proof about Abigail's childhood or formative experiences. Before she moved to Harlem, her life was a blank slate that made it impossible to get a full psychological picture of her. An analysis. All of the experts agreed that the Abigail Burke case was one of a kind in the history of American crime. There had been other cases of hospitality turning into entrapment on the frontier, so it wasn't the only one. What made this case stand out was the length of time, the fact that no one seemed to notice for 20 years, and the cold, methodical way the crimes were carried out and recorded. It wasn't an easy case to put into a simple category, and it kept coming up. Questions that don't have good answers. Abigail Burke's story started to reach new people through different forms of media as the 20th century went on. In the 1960s, there was a renewed interest in Appalachian folklore. At that time, bluegrass singers wrote ballads about the matriarch of the mountains, turning her dark history into sweet stories that were sung at festivals in the area. People from the area who knew her would call her the Black Widow, or the Mist Lady, instead of her real name in these songs. I knew right away who they were talking about. In 1967, a local musician named Thomas Mackenzie wrote one of these types of ballads that became very famous in the traditional music world. The words told a story about a traveler who gets lost and ends up in a remote house. The owner greets him with a warm smile and hot tea, but he soon learns that he is trapped and can't get out. The slow, sad music made me think of the mountains and the weight of the secrets that are buried under their old trees. After Mackenzie disclosed that his own great-great-grandfather had been one of the detectives who helped search Abigail's land. The stories had been told in his family for many generations. In the 1980s, an independent documentary director tried to make a movie about the case. He went to Harlem with recording gear in hopes of finding the original sites and maybe even the families of the people involved. What he found was a group that was still very reluctant to talk about what happened. When people talked about the specifics of how their ancestors had helped capture and then remove Abigail, it was almost as if everyone agreed that some things were better left in the past. The program was never finished. It was given up after months of interviews that led to more awkward silences than useful information. This reluctance to talk about the case in public was caused by more than just wanting to forget. A general feeling of shame was linked to the fact that Abigail had been able to do what she wanted for so long without being caught. The people in the area felt guilty because they hadn't seen the signs and weren't protecting tourists going through the area. This silent guilt was passed down from generation to generation and became a part of the local character in complicated ways that people were not fully aware of. When working to preserve Cookie's past, archivists had to deal with special problems when they worked with case materials. A lot of papers had been hidden or destroyed on purpose over the years. If there were ever photos of the original land, they were gone for good. Even though private collections and public archives were searched for a long time, Abigail's notebook, that detailed record that could have answered so many questions, was still missing. It seemed like someone was always trying to physically erase that part of the region's past, whether they were aware of it or not. As the subject of her master's thesis in 1993, Rebecca Sawyer, an anthropology student, picked the case of Abigail Burke. Sawyer took a different method than other researchers by focusing on how the case affected Appalachian culture over time instead of the specifics of the crime. She wrote about how the story had been used as a teaching tool by parents to teach their sons and girls to be careful and have a healthy fear of strangers. The story of Abigail had become a part of the region's moral fabric. It was a cautionary tale that had specific social uses. Sawyer also looked into the different ways the story was told, based on the situation and viewers. For tourists and people from other places who were interested, the story focused on the strange and supernatural, making Abigail seem like a magical figure of Southern Gothic horror. In local families, especially among older women, the story was told with more subtlety, recognizing the harsh reality of being a woman in the 19th century in remote areas, and not excusing or downplaying the horrible crimes that had been done. This two-sidedness in the story showed. There are some interesting conflicts. From one point of view, Abigail's actions had to be completely condemned as horrible and wrong. On the other hand, it was reluctantly admitted that women in that time had few choices and were under a lot of pressure. It didn't mean that what she did was okay or understandable, but it put it in a bigger picture that made the story less about pure evil and more about how extreme situations can make people break all moral rules. Many writers had to find a way to keep it all in balance, struggled to keep up. In the 1990s and 2000s, when the internet first came out, the Abigail Burke case got a new audience on websites that talked about old crimes and riddles that had not been solved. Online fans discussed ideas, argued over specifics, and sometimes planned their own trips to try to find the original plot of land. These trips rarely led to important findings, but they kept people interested in the case going and sometimes made new links between people who had been separated before. Little bits of information. One such fan, David Kowalski, a hobby genealogist, made an interesting find in 2008 while looking through immigration records. There was talk of a woman named Abigail Burke who had come to South Carolina from Germany in 1798. The dates and times she lived were pretty close to what was known about Abigail Burke. The sounds of Burkhardt and Burke were close enough to make it seem like the first name was changed to an English version. It would mean that Abigail was one of the first people in her family to come to the United States. She crossed the ocean when she was young and finished her life as a serial killer in the Kentucky mountains. This idea that they might have come from Europe raised more questions. Were there any crime records in Germany that might be linked? Did anyone in her family have a past of being violent or breaking the law? Why did she come to America by herself when most women did that at the time? Women usually went with families or in groups to keep them safe. Kowalski worked for years to find these links, by looking through German and American records. But at some point, the trail went cold because records were lost or burned during the European wars in the 20th century. Some researchers came around to the German origin idea, but others stayed skeptical. It's possible that the names match up by chance. In Germanic communities, Burkhardt was a popular last name, and records from the time show that there were a lot of women named Abigail, without more solid proof linking the immigrant of 1798. The link to the offender of 1857 was still just a guess. Another interesting idea in a long line of possibilities that haven't been proven. In the meantime, Abigail Burke's legacy continued to have a small but noticeable effect on the society of the Harland area. Innkeepers and lodging places had to deal with special problems. Some guests were so scared that they joked about waking up alive in the morning. Dark tourism started to grow slowly, with some local tour guides giving tours of historic. About the case, being careful to understand the feelings of the people who still live in the area and whose ancestors were affected by the tragedy. At the start of the 21st century, new technologies made it possible to look into old cases that didn't seem open to further investigation. Experts in forensic archaeology and earth analysis became interested in the Abigail Burke case because they saw it as a chance to use modern methods to solve a mystery that had been going on for hundreds of years. In 2011, a group led by forensic anthropologist Marissa Caldwell got permission to do exploratory excavations on the land where Abigail's house used to be. She hoped to find physical evidence that could help solve some of the case's unanswered questions. Before any digging was done, ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies were used to carefully plan the trip. The first results were both encouraging and upsetting. The radar picked up a number of strange things in the dirt, places where the density of the ground suggested that it might have been disturbed in the past. Some of these strange things looked like the size and shape of old graves, but it was impossible to know for sure what they were without digging them up. The team found the remains of the house's original base right where historical maps said it should be when they started digging. The fire that destroyed the building more than 150 years ago was proven by layers of ash. Among the rocks, the acidic mountain soil kept the pottery pieces, rusty household tools, and even some coins from that time in good shape. Each item was carefully categorized, photographed, and set up so that it could be analyzed later in the lab. The most important thing the team found, though, was far from the main foundation and in an area of the land that would have been covered in thick forest. Radar had picked up a very big and irregular object about 50 meters from the house. As soon as they started to dig, for some reason, they found something that made everyone there quiet down. The objects were buried on purpose and included well-preserved leather boots, pieces of fabric that used to be clothing, and most importantly, a number of personal items that would have been taken by travelers in the 1800s. Among these things was a pocket watch that was still mostly whole and had writing on the back about Henry's beloved Eleanor. It was the watch that Elalana Pritchard had talked about in. She gave her story more than 150 years ago. The last thing that made her feel connected to her late husband. The investigative team took great care to keep everything safe and write it down. They knew they were touching more than just archaeological evidence. They were also touching family memories and sadness that went beyond time. The finding finally put to rest the questions that families had had for generations about what happened to their ancestors. DNA evidence from today has helped make some links, found between the objects and their live descendants. When a great-granddaughter of Thomas Whitmore, the merchant who was one of Abigail's first known victims, heard that tools with her relative's initials on them had been found, she went to the excavation site. She stood there in silence for a long time, looking at the rusted piece of metal that was the last thing that showed her great-grandfather had lived. Over the course of several weeks, the team dug up and found at least 9. There were clear spots where things had been hidden. Given the amount of time that had passed and the state of the earth, they didn't find any preserved human remains, but the fact that many personal items were arranged in certain ways made it very likely that these were the places where Abigail had hid or buried proof of her crimes. Each finding lent more weight to the historical story, turning oral histories and pieces of documents into real things. The dig project got a lot of attention from the media, both in and around the area. A lot of reporters came to Harland and asked questions, filmed the scene, and talked to locals and the family's relatives. People in the neighborhood had mixed feelings about this new attention. A lot of people saw it as a chance to finally end a painful part of the region's past. Others didn't like the visitors because they thought that old wounds were being opened up for no reason to please the morbid curiosity of outsiders. As the leader of the forensic team, Marissa Caldwell made a point of working closely with the people in the area and having public meetings where she talked about the goals of the research and answered questions. She made it clear that the work wasn't meant to make headlines, but to give the victims honor by letting scientists know about their lives. Caldwell also promised that all the items that were found would be given to local museums or given back to families of the people who lost them and would never be kept as academic curiosities in faraway collections. This is one of the most interesting. A small notebook was found and buried away from the other things. Humidity and old age did a lot of damage to the pages, but current preservation methods have been able to read some of them. What those dirty pages showed was an upsetting look into Abigail's mind. Along with sales records of stolen items, notes on property care were written down. On the same page as cold estimates of how much money each victim had on them were cooking recipes. It was the nature of evil that was written down, smudged ink. When forensic psychologists looked at the recovered notes, they were amazed that the writings showed no feeling or moral justification at all. There were no efforts to explain or feel bad about what was done, and there were also no signs of sadistic pleasure or celebration. All of it felt very commercial, like Abigail was running a bad but necessary business. In a lot of ways, this emotional coldness was scarier than any passionate or crazy statement. It might have been. The project to dig up crime scenes also brought up moral questions about how people should treat these places in the present day. Different groups had very different ideas about whether they should be kept as memorials, left to return to their natural state, or used as educational tools. Some victims' descendants wanted a permanent monument to honor the pain their ancestors went through. Others wanted the whole area to be turned back into a forest so that nature could heal the land. In the end, a deal was made. A small, unassuming plaque would be put up near the spot to acknowledge the history without making the crimes seem more important or exciting than they were. The text was carefully written with the help of scholars, family members of victims, and community leaders. It said that the property had been the scene of major crimes in the 1800s. It honored the victims whose lives were cut short unfairly, and served as a reminder of how important it is for communities to look out for the weak. It didn't name Abigail, so it didn't give her the fame she might have wanted. The found items were finally given out as planned. Some of them were taken to the Kentucky Historical Museum and put together with other items to make a bigger display about crime and justice on the American frontier. Others were given back to families of descendants in secret emotional ceremonies. Eleanina's great-granddaughter was given Henry Pritchard's watch. She held it with tears in her eyes and felt a vibration through the cold metal. Linked to ancestors she had never met, but whose stories of loss and strength had shaped her family for many years. Many people became interested in the Abigail Burke case again, in ways that no one could have predicted in the years after the digs. Podcasts dedicated to historical crimes began producing in-depth episodes about the Appalachian Matriarch, some lasting several hours and exploring every known angle of the story. These shows were seen all over the world and introduced the story to people who had never heard of Harlan, Kentucky, and who were interested in this dark and complicated part of American history that had been lost. In 2016, an investigative reporter named Lauren Mitchell made one of these podcasts that revealed a shocking finding that no other researchers had seen. Mitchell was looking through court records from counties next to Harlan's when she found a reference to a strange trial that happened in Virginia in 1838. Someone who went by the name Abigail was accused of robbery and assault on a traveling merchant, but they were found not guilty because there wasn't enough proof. The dates and place matched the time that Abigail Burke was thought to have stayed in Virginia before she moved to Kentucky. If this really was the same person, it meant that Harlan had been acting dangerously for at least 20 years before his known crimes. That event in Virginia may have been a first try that went wrong or was cut short before it was finished. This acquittal could have taught Abigail important lessons about how to be more careful in her work, how to pick people who didn't have enough power to demand investigations, and how to better get rid of evidence. This means that her trial might have taught her enough about crime to make her the monster she would become. Mitchell tried to find out more about the Virginia case, but the records were mostly missing pieces, and many of them had been burned or lost during the American Civil War. In the mess. Walter Simmons, a merchant, was named as the one who made the claim, but nothing else was said about what had happened, or why the accusations had not led to a conviction. It was another interesting but unfinished piece of Abigail Burke's life puzzle. Mitchell's podcast also looked into a part of the case that other experts hadn't paid much attention to: how other people in the community might have been involved or worked with the suspects. How did Abigail sell the things she stole from other people without getting caught? Someone who usually bought used tools, pocket watches, or other personal items from a woman living alone in the woods might think this was strange. Mitchell found some signs that traders from faraway towns outside of Harlan County had bought goods from her over the years, probably without asking her a lot of questions about where the goods came from. It was normal in the United States in the 1800s for people to trade stolen goods through this unofficial network. Border, where the history of things wasn't really looked into very closely. Merchants didn't ask too many questions because they knew that many things came from sketchy places. Though there may not have been a planned plot, there was definitely collusion by convenient ignorance. It was this kind of unofficial business infrastructure that let thieves like Abigail turn stolen goods into cash without getting caught. As more people heard about the story through podcasts and the internet, with the help of documentaries, researchers from many areas began to use Abigail Burke's story as an example in their own. Criminologists looked at her as an example of a serial predator who operated before there were modern methods for finding and investigating criminals. Sociologists looked at how people in remote areas dealt with threats from within when official justice systems weren't working well or weren't easy to get to. Feminist historians disagreed about how to understand a woman who had dangerous power in a society that didn't give women real power. The last discussion was especially heated and hard to understand. There were feminists who said it was important not to romanticize or reinterpret Abigail as a woman who fought against patriarchal systems. Her crimes were horrible, and the people she killed were not guilty. It was also morally wrong to try to find progressive political meaning in her killings. Others agreed with this opinion 100%, but they still thought it was important to look at how historically disadvantaged women sometimes found power through horrible means, not to excuse, but to understand the complicated social forces that made people act the way they did. In 2019, a historical novelist named Patricia Drummond wrote a story that was partly based on the case of Abigail Burke. It was made very clear in the book Shadows in the Mountains that it was a work of fiction and not a true story. For example, Drummond made up speech, characters, and psychological reasons for things that didn't happen in the real story. The book had some success, selling especially well in the Appalachian region, where fans had very different thoughts about the book. Some people liked Drummond for bringing a forgotten part of regional history to people's attention in a respectful way. Others said the book was bad because it made up stories about real events that hurt real families. A descendant of Thomas Whitmore wrote an open letter that was printed in the Harland newspaper. In it, she complained about how her grandfather had been changed into a character in a book. She didn't blame Drummond of bad faith, but he did wonder if some stories were proper for fictional entertainment, especially since the victims' children and grandchildren were still alive and deeply affected by what had happened. Drummond reacted publicly in a humble way, admitting that the concerns raised were valid and promising to give some of the book's sales to groups that help the families of violent crime victims. Besides that, she added a longer introduction to later versions that made the lines between what happened in real life and what is made up in fiction. People talked about the morality of true crime stories after the show aired, and those conversations are still important now that true crime is becoming more popular as a genre of entertainment. Professional historians kept carefully writing down and preserving what they knew for sure about the case at the same time as these societal manifestations. The Kentucky Historical Society opened a digital archive in 2020 that was History of the State's Crimes, with a large part on Abigail Burke. The archive had scans of the original papers, transcripts of interviews with descendants, photos of artifacts found during the excavations, and essays by experts explaining what the artifacts meant. It was a useful tool for anyone who wanted to take their study of the case very seriously. The digital archive also had an interactive map that showed where the original property was, the known routes of travelers who went missing, and the towns where. Abigail had been seen many times. Putting all of this spatial information together visually showed patterns that weren't as clear when the data was presented separately in text files. Abigail's property was strategically placed at a natural intersection where several trails met and then split off again toward the mountains. Anyone traveling through that area would almost certainly come across that dark wooden house surrounded by thick woods. This location wasn't a mistake. Abigail had picked out or gotten that home just because of its great location. She knew that controlling a traffic jam on a major road would give her easy access to people who could be her victims. It was strategic thinking used for horrible purposes, which is more proof that she planned and thought out her crimes. There was nothing spontaneous or accidental about what Abigail Burke did. Everything was carefully planned, carried out, and written down by someone who saw crime as a long-term job. Today, even though Abigail Burke's crimes were found out more than 160 years ago, the place where her house used to be is now hard to tell apart from the forest that surrounds it. The trees are now very tall and dense, and their roots have grown over long-buried structures to form a web. The wind blows through the valleys the same way it always has, not knowing about the terrible things that have happened to people. People sometimes hike through the area in the fall, when the leaves turn shades of red and gold, without realizing they are there, going over ground that has such dark secrets. The small remembrance plaque that was put up after the excavations is still there, though it is partly hidden by moss and other plants. Not many people come across it, and those who do generally stop and think for a moment before going on their way. There aren't any big memorials or trips for tourists, and the horrible things that happened there aren't being used to make money. The people of Harlan chose not to make that sad part of their past into an attraction. Instead, they wanted to let it be. Nature takes back the place, and the memory is kept alive in a more respectful way. People still tell Abigail Burke's story in the small towns and villages that are spread out across the Appalachian Mountains, but they are more aware of how complicated it is now. It's not just a story about good versus evil anymore. It's a complex one about how systems fail, how vulnerable people are, how limited formal justice is, and how evil can hide behind normal appearances. Some teachers in the area use the case in. History lessons aren't meant to scare you, but to show you how societies worked and how they failed to protect the weakest members of society. For generations, the families of known victims have had to deal with the emotional weight of that past. Some have become strong supporters of crime victims' rights, using their grief over the deaths of loved ones to do useful work that helps people today who are going through similar tragedies. Some people would rather not be a part of the public story and instead honor their ancestors in secret. Dealing with pain from the past can be done in different ways, and each family has found its own way to include that dark history in its identity without letting it define them. The story of Abigail Burke is still interesting to researchers and scholars because there is so much we don't know about it. All the blanks in the story, the lost papers, and the questions that haven't been answered. All of these things leave room for more research and new conclusions. More and more new study methods are being created every decade. If files that have been closed to the public are opened, it's possible that more pieces of the story will be found. Anyone know where the lost notebook might be? It might be forgotten in a dusty attic. Maybe records from Europe will tell us more about where Abigail came from. Or maybe some mysteries are meant to be left unsolved. A humble warning that we can't know or understand everything. One thing we know for sure is that Abigail Burke's story makes us face uncomfortable truths about people in society. It shows how attackers can do well in places where victims aren't watched closely and are pushed to the edges. For people who don't have a lot of power or ties, this shows how formal justice systems often come too late. It shows how there is always a conflict between law justice and community justice, between following the rules and taking action. It also tells us that monsters don't always look horrible. Real horror can hide in plain sight, in the mask of respectability that hides something deadly. Plans. Universities where criminology and history meet still study the case as a standard example of a serial predator who operated before modern technologies for finding them. Students learn about Abigail Burke and other historical criminals by looking at patterns in their behavior, how they chose their victims, and how they hid from police. But it is always important to remember that behind the academic studies were real people whose lives were violently cut short and families who suffered. Terrible losses and towns that will always be scarred. The story of Abigail Burke is also a good way to remember to be kind and trusting. Even though the world is becoming more linked and less trusting at the same time, her story is still relevant today. It shows us that being careful around strangers is not a sign of paranoia, and that being cautious is not a sign of cynicism, but practical knowledge gained from many hard experiences. In the same way, time after time, we must not let fear turn us into a society where no one trusts anyone else and real kindness is impossible. Every generation has to find a new way to keep this delicate balance. If you go to the Appalachian Mountains today, they are still as beautiful and impressive as they were back then. Deep valleys, old woods, and clear streams that cut through moss-covered rocks all continue to amaze and awe people. But people who know about the past can't help but feel that. As they walk by the remote houses on the hillsides, they can't help but shiver. The smoke rising from faraway chimneys makes them think of all the secrets these old mountains still hold. The scenery is lovely, but it also holds memories. If you really listen, you can almost hear the stories that the wind whispers among the old trees. The title that got us here makes it sound like Abigail Burke was too bad for history books. Her acts were seen as too bad, so her name was taken off of many official records. Not suitable for official records, but memories that are shared last longer than paper and ink. History has been passed down from generation to generation, changing and adapting but never going away totally. And maybe it's right that it does. Not to honor fear, but to remember. To honor the people whose lives were cut short. To keep in mind the lessons of being alert and fair. To remember that evil exists and that groups have a duty to protect weak people from those who want to take advantage of them. What Abigail Burke's. There is no satisfactory ending to the story. The trial wasn't very exciting, the person didn't fully admit, and there wasn't clear and final justice. But maybe the real result is that people remember her not as a reason to celebrate, but as a reason to be careful. She didn't get what she may have wanted, whether it was fame, long-term wealth, or the power to decide who lives and dies. Instead, she became a sign of a terrible thing that people must always be on the lookout for and deal with. If you've made it this far on this dark trip through hidden truths and unsolved questions in the Appalachian Mountains. We hope you not only found a scary story, but also thought about how the past still affects the present. If this story moved you in any way, you might want to subscribe to this channel to see more stories that look into the dark and lost parts of history. Tell us what you thought about this case in the comments, along with your own thoughts on justice, memory, and how societies deal with hard parts of their past. Also, if you know, send this video to someone who likes hearing true stories told with care and respect. Until the next trip through the dark places of